I'm a mediator.
Uh-huh.
So that means I help groups and organizations and resolve conflicts around sustainability issues. So where there's an intersection between environmental concerns, you know, the economy, so people's concerns about jobs and how they're going to stay employed, and social concerns.
Okay.
And so in my capacity as a mediator and doing managing processes and facilitating processes, I do a ton of work with First Nations people and you know, with bands, with First Nations organizations, and with individuals who are themselves struggling with those sustainability issues too.
Okay.
And usually, who owns the land and who has control over making the decisions about the land is a huge part of the conflict that I am involved with. And trying to help those different groups come up with different ways of making these decisions is usually part of the solutions that we're talking about. So I'm either working inside a company who's operating on First Nations land, or First Nations land that's been claimed by land that's been claimed by First Nations, or I'm working among the different parties. So a place where it's sort of different groups are in conflict and interacting with one another. So government, First Nations, companies, NGOs, that kind of stuff. Does that make sense?
That does. So like obviously then you're seeing a lot of dealing a lot with treaties, right? Because that's a huge problem that you run into, obviously. Yeah.
So what's super interesting about BC, and I don't only work in British Columbia, but most of my work is in BC. What's really interesting and unique in Canada about BC is that, and you probably learned this, is that there's very, very few treaties
right.
settled in BC.
Only on Vancouver Island and in northeastern BC, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and actually it's really interesting, just quick pause on the northeastern BC Treaty 8 story. So that treaty was settled. Treaty 8 actually spans Alberta, the Yukon, and Northwest Territories, that sort of upper corner. So it's a huge part of land, some of which is in BC, right? But the people, the Treaty 8 people, are not just in British Columbia, they're in other provinces as well. And that's where Site C is located, the big hydroelectric dam that the Hydro wants to build. That's the big issue that's happening right now in the news. Have you heard about Site C?
No, I haven't actually.
So it's a big, huge, massive dam that they want to build up in the northeast.
Okay.
And what's interesting about that conflict right now is that it's one of the few areas of BC where there actually is a treaty that was settled. And so part of the conflict is that the government is not adhering to their treaty obligations. But it's very unique in British Columbia. Normally, the land was never settled in treaties, and so they have a mixture of different things happening on the land base now, because there's no historical treaty, like there's no treaty signed in the 1800s.
Yeah.
So there are, what's kind of intriguing is that there's a couple of examples of what they call modern-day treaties.
Oh, yeah. What?
May have heard of.
No, what does that mean?
So they're treaties that have been negotiated in the modern day, so within the last 30 years, since the BC treaty process was established. So approximately, you'd have to check the date, like when was the BC treaty process
I think
established?
it's 1993.
That sounds about right. It's been roughly 25, 30 years. There was an agreement between the federal government, the provincial government, and the BC First Nations, the First Nations Summit, where they came up with an agreement on starting a treaty process where they started to negotiate modern-day treaties. And so, for example, the Tsawwassen First Nation settled a treaty a few years ago. And prior to that, there was a big treaty signed with the Niska Nation up in northwestern BC. And there's a few other examples of treaties that have been settled in the last, whatever it is, they call it 30 years or 25 years
Yeah. So.
since the treaty process was established. But the point is that out of the hundreds of First Nations in BC, there's been only, a handful settled.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
most people consider it to be quite a significant failure.
Yeah, I was actually gonna bring that up. That sounds like very, very few actual treaties that were made or formed in like a span of 20 or 30 years.
And it speaks to the complexity of negotiating understandings of who has control over the land and who has control over what happens in the First Nation in the modern context. Just on for 6, Ash. Beth has asked me a question. What's that? Oh, careful. They're in the... Here, I'll show you. That looks awesome, by the way. Yeah, so treaties have a whole bunch of different... Like, I'm not an expert in treaty negotiations because I don't do that myself. But they sort of contemplate things like, healthcare, education.
Right.
Social services, areas of land. There's usually a financial component, so an agreement, like there's a deal, there's money that's given when the handover of control is passed on. There's a huge fisheries component, and when I was working more in fisheries, that's how I got into all this stuff, because determining how many fish a First Nation can take is usually a really complicated and difficult part of the treaty.
Okay.
So a treaty is about a whole bunch of different things, not just about who owns the land.
Yeah, yeah.
But it is a lot of the conflict, a lot of the chapters of a treaty that are most difficult have to do with land, like who's in control on the land.
Okay, yeah. So like that. So you're telling me that that's essentially what it's at the base. It's who has the control of the land. That's what the treaties are about. I mean, like.
So what's interesting, I don't know how much you follow this, but we have kind of a unique country in that we have a federal government and a provincial government. And there's, of course, municipal governments.
Right.
Municipal governments are responsible for areas in cities and towns. Right?
Yeah, yeah,
and
of course.
They have a certain area of responsibility that the province has given to them. They've delegated responsibility to, say, the city of Vancouver to look after sewers and water, right? The province doesn't do that. The federal government delegated responsibility to the provinces to deal with things like healthcare, education, mining, transportation. So there's all these things that happen on the land that don't actually involve the federal government. They are provincially regulated. They've been delegated. In our Constitution, there's a delegation of authority.
Right.
Now, First Nations they feel that their relationship is with the federal government.
So.
And that none of those there has been no delegation to the provinces or to municipalities in the lands that they claim as their ancestral territories. So if you actually added up all of the lands that First Nations claim as ancestral lands to them, I think someone did the math sometime, and you could look this up too to get the specific percentage, but it's something like 120% of British Columbia is claimed.
Oh, wow.
So it's all of BC plus a ton of areas where there's multiple claims that overlap.
Right, because there's there was shared territory and stuff like that, I assume.
Yes, yeah, and you could imagine that how people lived, right? Is that they moved around and they occupied lands at different times of year, and they have traditional and sacred sites in certain areas.
Right.
And there's like a core area, and then there's areas that are sort of broader in nature, and there's a lot of overlap. And that's another reason why the current treaty process has been very, I say a failure. I would call it a failure. And that has to do with the fact that
they're claiming the same land, right? So
that they can't agree whose land it is. because the First Nations themselves are in conflict.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. So,
There's many other reasons why the treaty process is not successful, but that is a big one, is that, to determine what exactly the land is that is under contemplation is very complicated.
right.
And the final thing, not the final thing, but I just want to say one other thing just to clarify. So in 93, these different organizations came up with an agreement that they would work through a treaty process.
Right.
But at that time, there were also a lot of First Nations that did not agree to even being part of the treaty process.
Oh, okay. So did that mean that they didn't want to?
They never agreed.
They didn't want to.
We're never going to negotiate an agreement with the federal and provincial governments because, well, they have lots of reasons for feeling that way. I can tell you about them if you want to know.
No, I can definitely understand why they would.
That's like a lot of detail, but it's so always from the beginning of this whole modern day conversation, there's been First Nations that are part of the treaty process and First Nations that are not.
Okay.
Treaty and non-treaty, and like or ones that signed on to the treaty process, ones that never did.
Okay.
So there's always been this significant difference. And so, like in 2016, now, what does this all mean? Like, it's been around for 30 years, there's all this complexity, blah, 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 blah. And then what's really interesting, too, is that in parallel with the treaty process, there was a huge legal case that was won